What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 75, and I'm the host, Kyle Anzalone. Today, Connor Freeman is my guest. He's a writer at the Libertarian Institute and just doing great work there. He's dropped some articles in the past couple of weeks. And right now, we have the fund drive going on at the Libertarian Institute, so I thought this would be a great time to talk about some of the stuff going on there. First of all, the Institute's great because Scott's giving a platform to people like myself and Connor, who didn't have much of a name before writing at the Institute, and it really has given us a platform to produce some really awesome work. And I do this show and the podcast, and Connor's been writing articles. Real quick before I turn over to Connor, I just want to mention to people who are only listening, first of all, the fund drives have been going well. We're well over halfway to our goal. This is going to help us for the whole year. $25 donation will get you a digital book, $50 donation a physical book. The rewards all the way up to $500. But the great thing about the physical book is you could get yourself a signed copy of one of Scott's books, either Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, Enough Already, and The Great Ron Paul. So, Connor, I got your articles up here that you've been writing at the Libertarian Institute, which, of course, we've also been writing in the Viewpoint section at antiwar.com. But it's been great having you at the Institute, Connor, and what kind of stuff are you planning on writing in the future?
Well, I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing, just covering the foreign policy and trying to get more of the word out on as far as like the new Cold War with Russia and China. I just wrote another one just leaning on people to let them know what the goals should be as far as ending the war in Yemen, how we got to focus on ending the blockade, covering how, the macabre normalcy of Joe Biden, how this is all a big crock of, the idea that Joe Biden is bringing back civility or whatever the liberals are trying to convince us that he's restoring to our politics. And also, like we discussed, the ratchet effect of how Trump's hawkishness on China is being instilled as just, regular old U.S. policy and just totally normal when it's absolutely not. And I just want to encourage people, please, to donate to the Institute. You're putting your money towards the fight for truth, liberty, and peace in real time. And this is a very important fight we're waging here with antiwar.com and the Libertarian Institute, making sure that people understand and are able to get through the propaganda wall and understand is the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today and that it needs to be stopped.
Right. Thanks for that,
And
Connor.
we have the best podcast and the best writers. Pete Quinones,
yeah.
Sheldon Richmond, Scott Horton, Kyle, Keith Knight, Kim Robinson. It's Wendy McElroy, Lori Calhoun. It's just incredible. And I'm leaving some names off because there's so many, but just check the site out. It's incredible.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for that, Connor. And just also remind people that it is a tax deductible donation. So, if you could save yourself a little bit of money, send it to the IRS and send it to us instead. That's a pretty sweet deal. The last thing I'll mention before we get rolling today is the sponsor of the show is Paloma Verde. Paloma Verde sells great CBD products, palomaverdestore.com. Right now, they're running a special on their extract with melatonin. Co-host of the show, Will Porter, has said that it helps him with his insomnia. I really like the extract myself. Helps with like headaches and minor pains, although I haven't used the one with melatonin yet because I don't have that much trouble getting to sleep. So check it out. They have a ton of great products there. I also really enjoy the Slav stick. I've been using that a lot lately. PalomaVerdeStore.com. Make sure you use the promo code PEACE to get yourself a discount at checkout. All right, Connor, let's get into what we have for the show today. Now,
Fantastic.
I really never expected to be talking about SNL on the show. As a rule, I don't watch SNL. So much of it is just like kind of establishment hackery. However, there was a 12-second clip I had to make an exception for, and maybe we'll just go ahead and play it first, and then we'll talk about the reaction and why it's important.
Israel is reporting that they vaccinated half of their population, and I'm going to guess it's the Jewish half.
So, Connor, it's not a super long clip, but at the same time, it sends a pretty big message, I think, that you have a situation where especially in the U.S., we're hyper aware of, what the ratios are if, Black, Hispanic Americans are getting, a disproportionate or not, or, a fair amount of vaccines, and that, there's, some criticism around that, and some of that may be justified, but it's nothing like what's happening in Israel, where I don't think any vaccinations have gotten into Gaza yet, at least as of the recording of this show. They're trying to get 2,000 in, but they're waiting on Israeli approval for that. And so really this is the worst disparity maybe of any country in the world between the two populations, one being able to get vaccines and getting a lot of vaccinations, and the other countries struggling to get any. So, Connor, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, it's well, first of all, it's cool to see. I always look at I mean, I think you're absolutely right that SNL is sort of a platform for really kind of right-wing propaganda, imperial propaganda disguised as sort of a faux counter. It's supposed to look like counterculture and act like counterculture, but it really isn't. It's kind of towing the line with all their Russiagate nonsense and their lionizing of whether it's Robert Mueller or Jimmy Carter back in the day. You look at how they demonize Gaddafi and Assad and Putin, and Kim Jong-un, and everybody I think knows this. But what's interesting is they made this joke. And to me, it signifies a change in the conversation, a paradigm shift in the zeitgeist, sort of like how Trump had to sort of come off as anti-war in order to gain the support of regular people, which I think is an exciting development. And this is sort of the same thing, and it kind of throws a wrench into the propaganda about Israel's vaccination program, because you have people like the new UN Middle East envoy kind of promoting Israel as being really at the top of its of the top of the heap in terms of vaccinating its population, and
I feel like most of the
Fauci
mainstream media is pushing
things.
that narrative that Israel so far has had the most successful vaccination program, and they allow the data to come through where they show the Israeli population, but they don't count the occupied people who Israel is responsible for vaccinating. If you have a military occupation of a people, and they throw in this Oslo Accords thing, but look, you can sign an entire agreement to like have a normalization of relations, and set up a process where the Palestinians would have their own state, and then decades later still cite that in just this only one provision when the rest of the agreement hasn't been lived up to and progress hasn't been made on, and say, oh, look, the Palestinians are responsible for their own medical care. Especially in this case where in Gaza, you have to get approval from the Israelis to bring the medicine in. And it's not even like the Gazans or the Palestinians had to beg the Israelis for the vaccinations. Apparently, Russia donated these 2,000 doses. They're just asking permission to bring them from, I guess, Ramallah and the West Bank over to Gaza City for the frontline health workers, and they're being denied and stonewalled and stuff like that. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of important, nuance here that the mainstream media isn't getting into when they talk about Israelis' vaccination program.
Yeah, you've got the Times of Israel saying to Fauci, so do you think they should help vaccinate the neighboring Palestinians like it's like another country next door? And he goes, I'm paraphrasing, but I think this is pretty close. He goes, well, that's a political question, and I don't do political questions. They get me into trouble. And but other than that, he basically was saying, he was just praising Israel. You have and he, as well as this UN envoy I mentioned before, Tor Wennesland, he basically they all sort of play into this. They have this kind of song they sing about how this is a collective effort, and really there's the pandemic knows no borders. Only collectively we can achieve results. And then they completely negate this this war crime, essentially. Like you said, it's a collective punishment, which is a violation of Article 33 of the Fourth Geneva Convention. And like you said, I believe it's Article 56. The occupying power is responsible for the health and hygiene of the occupied population. And in fact, as they say in the articles that we're covering, Specifically, the article makes particular reference, this is a quote, particular reference to the adoption and application of the prophylactic and preventative measures necessary to combat the spread of contagious diseases and epidemics. And the author says, not only has Israel refused to abide by its obligations, but it is also now undercutting the Palestinian Authority's efforts to get the vaccine to medical workers in Gaza. And it's, like we said, collective punishment. And, but this is sort of par for the course. They're even talking about how they can extract concessions from the Gazans and use the vaccines as sort of like bait to get them to do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do, and use it as like a bargaining chip. It's really disgusting. So it's good to see somebody to call this out. And of course, it's being called anti-Semitic, which is of course ridiculous. I'm sure a Jewish person wrote that line.
The articles have been published at The Electric Intifada by Maureen Claire Murphy. This one titled "Israeli Uses Vaccines as a Bargaining Chip," and you touched on that one. And then the other one that I have been showing before is titled "Fauci Champions Israeli Medical Apartheid," which sounds like a very provocative title, but when again you actually get into the data and the discretion between who's getting vaccines and who's isn't, I think it's pretty clear. One of the disturbing parts to me, and to focus on Fauci here just for a second, is that NPR reports that Fauci received a $1 million prize for speaking truth to power amid the pandemic. And this prize came from Tel Aviv University. And so there's probably a step away there from the actual government of Israel, but I think if Harvard University had gave $1 million prize to, you see that as a pretty establishment decision. And so it seems pretty crazy that Dr. Fauci would go and praise the Israeli response to, their vaccination program when they're not vaccinating the Palestinian population, and he just received $1 million prize for speaking truth to power, and here he is just going along with the powerful oppressing the absolute weak. He's doing the exact opposite of that, where he's actually kind of giving a green light to a program. Connor, just imagine if this was the US here, and let's say Donald Trump was refusing to give vaccinations to majority Muslim, not Muslim, Mexican, or, like Hispanic communities, like on the southern border, or if he was, saying there's no vaccination sites within the inner city, people would be going crazy over the racial disparities created by that. And rightfully so. And here you have it, and you have the great Dr. Fauci, who we're all supposed to just constantly take him at his word for what's happening with coronavirus, completely unwilling to speak truth to power and just going along with an apartheid medical system.
Right. And it's also like, because it's one of the most densely populated places on Earth. You've got 2 million people living in this open air prison camp. They're not allowed to leave. They've already had more than 500 deaths from COVID. Nobody has been vaccinated. Nobody's gotten any vaccines. And by the way, to be honest, I'm not super enthusiastic about the vaccines. And if I were the Palestinians, I'd be reluctant to take a vaccine that was provided to me by Israel necessarily. But I know this isn't necessarily an Israeli manufactured vaccine, but still, it's like, let's suppose that this is absolutely a preventative measure and it's safe. Then this is absolutely a disgusting war crime. And it would be equivalent to locking a bunch of, like you said, Mexican people up in the sort of the DHS internment, the ICE camps, and then not only you're restricting medical care to these people, but also food, fuel, and then you would be like bombing those same places during a pandemic, which is Gaza has been bombed since COVID broke out. So it's really, unparalleled. It's just incredible. This is such light criticism that it makes waves because it's such a rare thing to see.
Right.
So it's exciting to see this happening though, because certainly it's getting the conversation out there.
Right.
That's important.
The SNL joke is the exciting part, just to highlight that.
Oh yeah, I apologize.
A couple of news stories on this I want to mention. The first is that the UN says that the Palestinian vaccination program is $30 million short. This story broke after Biden pledged $4 billion of U.S. funds, so I'm not sure why. Apparently, none of that money is going to this. But the other concerning thing going on in Israel is, and this is getting a lot of praise, is that with Israel's vaccination of a large percentage of the Jewish population now of the country, that they're starting to reopen and they have what they call our green passes. Those people who have both doses of the vaccine more than a week prior or recovered for the disease are able to kind of move about freely. Well, this seems pretty disturbing. If you're only vaccinating the Jewish portion of the population, it's essentially preventing the Palestinian population, even more so than usual, from accessing the parts of the community that you need the green pass to access. I think this is one of the real problems with having like the vaccine passports and stuff, is that if you're going to require people to have vaccines to travel, then you're going to be able to prevent people from traveling by not giving them the vaccine. And that seems like what Israel is doing here to the Palestinians, where, they're going to say, oh, well, we can't let any of the Palestinians out of the West Bank or Gaza because they could have COVID because they don't have the vaccine, but they also won't give them the vaccine. And so, just another reason to be opposed to these terrible vaccine passports and the Israeli system here. I'm not sure if you caught this one, Connor, but U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken recently said that he stresses the two-state solution in the Palestinian conflict. I have a lot of problems with the two-state solution. I guess at this point it doesn't seem workable. I had I don't know if he was an Israeli American, but Carlman Barclay lived in Israel for a long time, and as kind of a right wing, around a lot of right wing like Jewish people, and he says that the few thousand people that had to leave Gaza before Operation Cast Lead there is treated like such a tragedy. There's no way that there's ever going to be enough Jewish settlers to leave the West Bank to allow for a Palestinian state. And I think that's a pretty accurate assessment of the situation, why the two-state solution doesn't work. And so rather than proposing an actual solution to the problem now, it seems like the U.S. is kind of reverting back to one of these, well, whenever the Palestinians are ready to let the Israelis be a state, then they could have a state too position. And, that may mean that they're saying that the Israelis shouldn't be building new settlements in the West Bank and stuff, but at the end of the day, they're not talking about cutting off the $3.8 billion in aid the U.S. gives Israel every year. They're not talking about cutting off weapon sales. Israel's looking for another fleet of F-35s and some KC-46 refueling planes. I'm guessing they're going to get those. The U.S. is going to help Israel build their new ballistic missile defense system, the Arrow 4, not threatening to cut that off. And so I don't think they're pushing towards any real solution here. Anything else on this, Connor?
Well, it's it's when you see these actual developments and these actual quotes, it's just as gross. But we could have expected it. We knew Blinken. Blinken and Biden are huge Zionists, and I call them apartheid enthusiasts. Like when Blinken makes such a big deal out of, look, the Israelis he's basically marketing himself to the Israeli lobby, and this is what Biden is doing too. When they go, I said, and I'll say it again, like, I will not condition aid to Israel under any circumstances. This is what they're saying. So the two-state solution means nothing. It hasn't for a very long time. It just means essentially that that's what we're going with as far as our PR, and Israel and the settlers can continue to put, to make, what do they call it, the facts on the ground. And so, of course, the Palestinians will continue to have less and less land, and it increasingly looks more and more like a sort of a Bantustan South African situation where it's just a overtly and obvious apartheid state.
Right.
And they'll call it, I don't know if they're going to call it the peace deal of the century or whatever. That's already been used, or that PR has already been cashed out. But it's not really that much of a difference in terms of substantive policy.
Yeah. There's a couple of news stories I just want to note. That this one I think is important, especially for people who really read the news. It says Israel, this is from Reuters, Israel aims to resolve Iran disputes with Biden at advisor level. And actually, they've toned down the rhetoric from the original headline of the story, but they were saying that the Israel wants to keep the debate with the Biden administration under the radar. Was the quote they first used here, which was interesting because on the show with Will, I had mentioned that I hadn't seen a lot of Israel publicly coming out saying that if the U.S. gets back in the JCPOA, then we're going to leave, or then we're going to have to bomb Iran. That wasn't happening in the past week, so I was wondering if maybe, you know, the Biden overtures towards Iran to as weak as they are to restore the JCPOA aren't even serious because Israel wasn't throwing a fit, but maybe this is the reason why. Then the other note I have here is that, and this is from Reuters again, Netanyahu's corruption trial to resume after the election. Israel's going to hold its fourth election in I think 2 or 3 years here in March. And Netanyahu isn't looking great in polling, although he hadn't been in the lead up to a couple elections now. And so I'm unsure what happens in the election. I don't want to make any predictions. I don't understand Israeli politics well enough. But it seems like the results of the election may determine if Netanyahu ends up in jail or not. So I expect him to be very, very, very savage trying to cling to power here. And I guess we should resume, expect this trial to resume towards the end of March. And then the last thing
So you're expecting him to interfere quite a bit more than on Iran policy in the meantime, in the lead up to the election.
Yeah,
I was sort of suspecting
I would guess
that
so.
too.
Yeah,
because I remember before Biden came in, there was a debate where he was trying to box Gantz out of talks, and there was a kind of an argument over whether or not to take an overt kind of they were sending a bunch of envoys over to the U.S. But the idea was, do we sort of do this more or less behind the scenes, or do we make a big public display of our opposition to the Iran deal? And they've sort of, it looks like there's been a lot of public opposition from the Israelis to the Iran deal. And I noticed, I know Biden waited to talk to Netanyahu for like a month, but although the chief of staff there at the Israeli military, I think it's Aviv Kohevi, who's a huge hawk, who's talked about how he wants to he and Gantz have talked about drawing up plans to attack Iran. They very quickly got meetings with not only Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, but also Frank McKenzie, head of CENTCOM, which has me concerned because McKenzie is, the best example of like public choice economics, like the sort of James Buchanan stuff where you're just out for your own bureaucratic priorities and your own individual ends. McKenzie is the guy who, as Gareth Porter has shown, was largely behind. I'm not saying that the Israelis and sort of the hawks in Trump's administration and even Biden, because we've seen B-52s fly over the Persian Gulf under Biden, that they don't support this kind of policy anyway. But they found a great ally with guys like McKenzie in particular, because McKenzie was trying to, because of the great power competition shift to East Asia and Europe, he was trying to retain and expand his power under CENTCOM in terms of military assets and personnel. And we know Israel has been moved into CENTCOM now. Well, I don't know if it's official, but they're making the transition from Eurocom to CENTCOM. So the politics there are very interesting. And I haven't seen so many details of those meetings, but I wish I knew more and would like to find out more about what was going down in those meetings.
Right.
Because Austin met with Gantz as well.
You're right. That you made some great points there. First of all, the superficial, really point that Biden was making by refusing to call Netanyahu. I'm guessing it was more because Netanyahu refused to call Biden right away and congratulate him on his election victory. And as you say, all the back, all the backdoor ties and everything were still ongoing. The Biden administration pledged to not touch the Israeli aid. There's never any real question that they're going to re-examine the U.S. alliance with Israel. Hell, they even said, they're going to continue to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. And then
Blinken had those weird comments about Golan as well, where he's like, legality aside, this is very important to Israel's security.
Right. And for Netanyahu, that wasn't even good enough. He said, no, it's a part of Israel. But I wanted to mention that it was great to tie the Israeli election in the politics there to the JCPOA, just because I think it's a fantastic point to make that it seems it seems like it would be a major blow to Netanyahu to see the U.S. re-enter that agreement before the election, because one of the things he really brags about is how, because of his leadership, he's, tied so close to the U.S. And so he's obviously publicly against this, that the U.S. goes ahead with it. It makes, I think, him look less credible. So all this, as you said at the beginning, Connor, I think it's good that, we're able now to at least have some people make these jokes. And look, he didn't get canceled. He didn't get Gina Carano'd. He wasn't out in, 24 hours. And I'm not saying that the push to, cancel this guy isn't over. But at the same time, it wasn't enough, and the facts are so obvious that I think if they do blow it up, it'll kind of blow up in their face a little bit. Where, Gina Carano's tweet wasn't about any real scandal, so making a big deal out of it doesn't really expose anything, but making a big deal out of this, I think, is exposing. And I also, again, just the more you could break down the fact that you could criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic is something that we have to do culturally. So taking steps in the right direction here on this one. Should we move on, talk about 60 minutes little segment here on Syria?
Yeah, we've got some good Syria war propaganda to go over.
All right, so I'm going to play about a minute of this clip. It's a recent 60 minutes video that they put out on Syria, Caesar, and the sanctions there. So again, I'll go ahead and play a minute or so of this.
In order to utilize them in this hearing in Congress. And a staffer who helped us with this bought a Patagonia jacket, that blue jacket that's become very iconic and tied to Caesar. As I was translating to Caesar, as he whispered in my ear his answers, all of these Congress people were sitting in stunned silence, listening to testimony that would shake mountains. After we finished our testimony, take Caesar back to the hotel, my phone was just hammered by calls and messages. Republicans and Democrats from the House Foreign Affairs Committee sat down with me and sat down with Caesar and began discussing what is it that we can do. And that was the beginning of the Caesar Syria Civilian Protection Act. The Caesar Act does multiple things. It calls the situation in Syria for what it is: massacres against the Syrian people by Russia, the Assad regime, Iran, and their allies. For the State Department to not only document, but also support the pursuit of prosecutions against these war criminals. The Caesar Act also calls for increased humanitarian aid and also has sanctions provisions.
Yeah.
All right, Connor. So I really like how he tries to lead the sanctions there and kind of dismisses them at the end. Oh yeah, and there's an economic war going on against Syria too. Yeah, the humanitarian aid, all of it, but the economic war is the down thing. But you say this is Syrian war propaganda. So let's break that down.
Yeah. So first of all, the Caesar Act is this brutal sanctions regime on that had bipartisan support that was imposed under the Trump administration. It's really, in addition to Trump occupying northeastern Syria with the Kurds and occupying the oil fields, which there's not much money that could come from the oil production in Syria. It's like was it like 1/500th or something of the daily output of Saudi Arabia. It's something really modest and almost insignificant, but it's still something that they should not be deprived of. But the Caesar Act is much more effective economically speaking because it directly targets the engineering and the construction industries and basically criminalizes anybody of any nationality doing business with Syria to help them rebuild after the devastating nearly 10-year war at this point. So what I found out was I recognized that guy when you sent me the video. I looked it up and I'm like, I recognize that guy from the John McCain photo when he's hanging out with the Northern Storm Brigade. And it turns out that this guy, Muaz Mustafa, who's still doing his same bit as the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force, is still running sort of propaganda ops for the Syria war. So I wanted to cover some of this stuff. So first of all, on the topic of the Caesar Act and this guy Caesar, who he brought to testify to Capitol Hill about these photos he had. He goes through and he claims that they show the torture. He says the guy used to be a photographer for the defense, I believe the Assad's defense ministry, and he was told to document the torture of civilians under the Assad regime. And so Rick Sterling's great piece here, Caesar tries to suffocate 17 million Syrians, opens by saying, this new law is fraudulent on 2 counts. It called Caesar in reference to a 2014 propaganda. It is called Caesar in reference to a 2014 propaganda stunt involving an anonymous Syrian who was alleged to be a military photographer. He claimed to have 55,000 photos showing about 11,000 victims of Syrian government torture. As the Christian Science Monitor said at the time, the Caesar report was a well-timed propaganda exercise funded by Qatar. A 30-page analysis later confirmed that the Caesar report was a fraud, with nearly half the photos showing the opposite of what was claimed. They documented dead Syrian soldiers and civilian victims of rebel car bombs and attacks. And of course, Qatar was heavily involved in backing the so-called opposition, which was primarily made up of al-Qaeda, al-Nusra militants and their linked groups. But this guy, Muaz Mustafa, was a great report after John McCain died, a fitting eulogy written by Max Blumenthal at Consortium News called The Other Side of John McCain, which documents McCain's history of aligning with the worst kinds of far-right terrorist entities of all stripes, be they the Nazis in Ukraine, the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group, and the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group in Libya, and in this case, the Northern Storm Brigade and al-Qaeda type militants in Syria. So Max covers this and he goes, so like Libya, Syria had resisted aligning with the West and was suddenly confronted with a Salafi jihadi insurgency armed by the CIA. Once again, McCain made it his personal duty to market Islamist insurgents to America as a cross between the Minutemen and the Freedom Riders of the civil rights era. To do so, he took under his wing a youthful DC-based Syria-American operative named Muaz Mustafa, who had been a consultant to the Libyan Transition Council during the run-up to the NATO invasion. In May 2013, Mustafa convinced McCain to take an illegal trip across the Syrian border to meet some freedom fighters. An Israeli millionaire named Modi Kahana, who coordinated efforts between the Syrian opposition and the Israeli military through his NGO, Amaliha, claimed to have, quote, financed the opposition group, which took Senator John McCain to visit war-torn Syria. And so here's some great quotes from Mustafa. He goes, this could be like his Benghazi moment, Mustafa remarked excitedly in a scene from a documentary, Red Lines, that depicted his efforts for regime change. McCain went to Benghazi, he came back, we bombed. So he says, Max Blumenthal says, during his brief excursion into Syria, McCain met with a group of CIA-backed insurgents and blessed their struggle. The senator wanted to assure the Free Syrian Army that the American people support their cry for freedom, support their revolution, Mustafa's view with CNN. And then McCain's office released the famous photos of himself with Mustafa and the Northern Storm Brigade. And I found a great quote from Mustafa when he's being interviewed at this article at the Islamic Monthly by a international human rights lawyer and senior research fellow at Georgetown University, Arsalan Ifik Hattar. He interviewed Mustafa And he says, according to him, Senator McCain came away with a much more thorough understanding of the conflict and the situation on the ground. He was reassured that the United States government had vetted the good guys that we must support in order to defeat the regime and marginalize any extremists. And I think we have a great clip from Scott Horton's new video series of his new book, Enough Already, talking about just who these good guys were.
And weapons into that country to help the jihadists fight. Now, most of the time, it's true, they had a somewhat deniable operation where they would have a less jihadist, more moderate type group that would promise to hold elections one day or something, would receive the bulk of the money and the guns. But in that war, all those things, of course, were fungible. And of course, the battle was led not by moderates at all, but by the extremists of the al-Nusra Front, which, as Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's State Department were all too happy to verify and confirm for us, that the al-Nusra Front is nothing but an alias, their words, an alias for al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. When John McCain traveled to Syria in 2013, he met with some mythical moderates called the Northern Storm Brigade, and took some pictures and posed with them and promised American support, which was delivered. But then it came out that this same group, the Northern Storm Brigade, were responsible for kidnapping and murdering a bunch of Lebanese Shiite pilgrims. They were the same group that later sold Steven Sotloff to ISIS, who cut his head off. Well, then there's the Farooq Brigade. They're pretty moderate. They said they wanted to hold elections and would respect freedom of speech and religion. Oh, here's some footage of their military commander eating a dead soldier's heart. But then there's Noor al-Zinki. Those guys are moderate. CIA gave them zillions of dollars worth of guns, tow missiles. Yeah, they're the ones filmed beheading a young man in the back of a pickup truck and laughing about it. These are essentially bin Ladenites, no different from the agenda of al-Qaeda, and nothing moderate about them. There never was.
All right, and that again is from the great video series produced by Gus Cantavaro for Scott Horton's new book, Enough Already. Check that out. You can find it on YouTube on Scott's channel, or he's been posting all those up on Twitter. But right there, I mean, I think he really does a great job of breaking it down of who the Syrian rebels actually were, and more importantly, who the U.S. mainstream, including John McCain, has pretended that they were. These are the worst of the worst kind of people, and also the kind of people that Americans, if there are people in the world Americans should be worried about, it's the kind of people that are willing to eat a heart or behead a young kid, sell our journalists to someone who beheads them, and all this other disturbing stuff. So any more debunking to do on this 60 minutes video? I know we can't get into every last lie, but if there's any other big ones, I'd love to hear it.
Sure. Well, first of all, before I forget, I just want to mention to everybody, because everybody loves the Kagans and their sort of neocon mafia family. This guy who's in this 60 minutes video and was posing there with McCain and the Northern Storm Brigade was tangentially connected to Kim Kagan's think tank, the Institute for the Study of War, because she had employed as a fellow there this lady named Elizabeth O'Baggy, who also did consulting for Mustafa's Syrian Emergency Task Force, which was, of course, a conflict of interest. But McCain and John Kerry had brought this woman to Capitol Hill again to testify about how moderate the rebels were. And then quickly there was a embarrassing scandal because she had faked having a she had written editorials in the Wall Street Journal that had been cited by McCain, for instance, but quickly Kagan had to fire her because it came out that she had faked having a PhD in Arabic studies. But then, of course, as Blumenthal points out in the piece, she went through the Beltway's revolving door, striding into the halls of Congress as McCain's newest foreign policy aide. So I think it's just interesting to point out that, this guy is, like I said, it's sort of 6 degrees of separation. you can always find a neocon there somewhere when you've got, especially when you're talking about Syrian war propaganda. And if you watch the full clip that this guy does, he's talking about, how he's got, like you said, humanitarian aid projects to help civilians and these poor besieged people in the Idlib province. I don't deny that there are a lot of civilians who have been cornered into the Idlib province, unfortunately. There were a lot of civilians who were killed when Trump and Obama carpet bombed Raqqa and other places during Iraq, what Scott Horton calls Iraq War III, in Syria and Iraq. You got these militants and these Al-Qaeda linked groups that the U.S. and their allies like Israel, Saudi, Qatar, Turkey, the U.K., France backed. They conquer areas and often enslave people and then sort of embed themselves in these areas. And then, of course, if the U.S. didn't do this in the first place, and the U.S. striking places like Syria is illegal in the first place. But on the other hand, Russia has been invited to Syria to deal with the problem there. But it's still a tragedy. But the fact is, when he talks about, we're helping women's groups in the Idlib province, it's interesting that he says that, because what he's not saying is that Brett McGurk, who was the envoy to the Global Coalition Against ISIS, who I believe is now Biden's National Security Council coordinator for Middle East affairs, who resigned after Trump basically made it clear that he was interested in withdrawing from Syria. This guy resigned in protest. However, he's got some quotes from a speech he gave at the Middle East Institute, I believe in 2017, where he called the Idlib province in northwestern Syria there the greatest Al-Qaeda enclave in the world since 9/11, filled with militants connected to and aligned with Ayman al-Zawahiri, for instance, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the one of the main guys involved in the 9/11 attack, and all of Bin Laden and Bin Laden's most famous and infamous crimes. So, of course, this is a treasonous policy in the first place, and it's just interesting that they, he even had the white helmets on there who have been connected to Al-Qaeda and running psyops in like Duma, for instance, which were quickly debunked in media, whether it was Aaron Mate or Robert Fisk, or I think Peter Hitchens as well. But they were able to use, for instance, and Cy Hirsch in the case of Khan Sheikhoun. There's been these false flag attacks where the U.S. government and actually France and the United Kingdom used these kind of BS pretenses, well, they are BS pretenses, to bomb the Syrian government and the country itself. And I mean, this is just a continuation of it. It's like I always find it interesting. It's like I've referenced before here and in my articles about Bernie Sanders' Syria page on his campaign website. It's as if these people have such low respect for their audience that they just assume that you don't know any of this. So yeah, I can blame Assad for chemical weapons attacks that have been proven that he didn't do, and I can blame him for all the casualties in the war. And they just continue to do it. And like the white helmets, I mean, people basically know what's going on there. That there's a reason why they only operate in areas that are held by Al Qaeda and the Al Qaeda type groups. They work with them, so it's just, I don't know. It's like they're rerunning the old hits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you nailed like most of the important propaganda points there. And now that, especially that we're back within the Biden administration, and not that Trump ended the war in Syria or I put enough of an effort into it to try to, but he did announce a couple times I was ending the war in Syria. You mentioned that Brett McGurk resigned over it, who was a U.S. official involved in Syria, but more importantly, even his Secretary of Defense, James Mattis, resigned over that. And it wasn't McGurk, it was his eventual replacement, James Jeffries, that openly said that we were lying to the president about the number of troops we had in Syria. They're playing a shell game there. And one of the reasons I'm sure they're doing that is the potential that a Democrat would come back in office and they would have the ability to try another regime change effort in Syria. I don't think it's a complete coincidence, Connor, that this runs after Biden takes office, when, you know, he has to decide, are we going to keep U.S. troops in Syria or leave? You know, this is the kind of propaganda they need to continue this effort. Should we move on and talk about, you know, probably the most important thing there is to talk about, and that is the U.S. engaging in these great power competition. You have this really great article at the Libertarian Institute. We ran it last weekend as the spotlight of antiwar.com, and you title it, "Joe Biden Will Embroil America in Great Power Politics." So, I mean, not that Trump didn't do this, but explain how it's about to get worse.
Yeah, sure. So that's actually kind of the point of the piece. I tried to my best to summarize what you've called the ratchet effect, where sort of Trump, there's this propaganda, and I think you and Will did a fantastic job. There's an incredible piece you wrote last year called "Dangerous Game: How Russiagate ignited a new, or the wreckage of Russiagate ignited a new Cold War," which basically talks about how the U.S. has, you know, it's codified since 2017 and 2018 in this sort of new national security strategy about great power competition with Russia and China. But really, what that is saying, I suppose, is we're shifting away from counterterrorism ops in the Middle East and North Africa and focusing more on this hawkish position, this war footing, really, with Russia and China. And so, but as you point out in Dangerous Game, this has been going on since basically the end of the Cold War. You had Helmut Kohl and the West German chancellor there, and James Baker and George H.W. Bush promised Gorbachev that they would not expand NATO 1 inch eastward if they allowed a reunification under NATO of Germany. And of course, as soon as, you know, the next president, Bill Clinton, is adding like the Czech Republic and Poland and Hungary into the NATO alliance. So, and since then you have Bush too, adding, you know, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Bulgaria, Slovakia, Slovenia, and they actually, under Bush, he was trying to get Ukraine and Georgia as well, which is something that Biden and Anthony Blinken support as well. And I point out in the piece that could start a war, of course, because there are Russian forces in Georgia and in I just don't think. I mean, it's more deniable in the case of Ukraine. Certainly not in Crimea, of course. But you know, NATO and the U.S. believe that Crimea belongs to. That's why when Biden says, you know, it's this is all about Ukraine's national sovereignty, and I always point out the hypocrisy of that, because he and Victoria Nuland, potentially his Secretary of State, were, you know, they were two of the main people behind the coup in Ukraine in 2014 under the Obama administration, where they put they did a regime change, and they took out Yanukovych and put in Poroshenko, and the sort of the neo-Nazi types like the Azov Battalion and the Social Nationalists, the Svoboda Party, the Right Sector, and a lot of these groups who were involved in the, as you point out in Dangerous Game, who were involved in the street putsch there, battling with security forces. They were ingratiated into the coalition and integrated into the National Guard there. So they've put Nazis in power on Russia's doorstep. And my point, I guess, was talking about how Trump, Russiagate, like you said, has basically brought the liberals and, as you say, the moderate progressives on board with this new Cold War policy. And it was already that this policy was already there, but I don't think the American people, particularly the Democrats, who were kind of burned by, were very I don't think they were proud of particularly Obama's intervention in Libya and the drone war or the drone program. and all the civilian casualties there. Not that they did much about it, but they weren't really behind it. They weren't enthusiastic about it, let's say. And of course, the Iraq War was a total disaster. And by and large, I think the Democratic constituency knew that and was against it. And again, maybe they of course they should have done more to stop it, but I don't think they really support it. Thing is, Russiagate, they're very behind. They're very. This has gotten them to be extremely Russia, and the Trump administration came in there and was sort of, as I say, the corporate press has this orange cartoonish caricature of him as Putin's puppet, but he in February 2018 he's killing Russians in Syria. There's a debate over how many were killed, and this was in northeastern Syria there. But Russian mercenaries, it's been confirmed by a spokeswoman from the foreign ministry that at least 5 Russian nationals were killed when the Trump administration started bombing people there in northeastern Syria.
And that might not sound like a lot, but just to highlight there, imagine if a Russian bomb had killed 5 Americans, even if they were contractors in Syria, where every American knows they have absolutely no business being. If a Russian bomb had killed them, there definitely would have been large and very loud calls for igniting World War III with Russia. Not that it necessarily would have been pushed to that, but I think that you would have seen a lot of very overt American reaction to it where you didn't see that from Russia. So I always just think that's a really important point of how some of these politics work and who's aggressing against who.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've also pointed out before here on the show about how and I show in the piece as well, wanted to get it down there in the article about how, Michelle Flournoy and Eric Edelman and Stephen Hadley and Robert Kagan wrote that famous report for CNES, where they said basically what Hillary Clinton's policy should be vis-a-vis Obama's, how it would be different. And what they wanted was Hillary to arm Ukraine, something that Obama wouldn't do. And they wanted increased military threats to Iran and increased action in Syria and Iraq. And Trump did all of that. And on the other hand, you have to look at what Michael Morrell was saying, who was almost the CIA director. Thankfully, he's not. But that guy was, Tenet's right-hand man, helping lie us into the Iraq War. But beyond that, he was on the Charlie Rose show. What was it, 2016, where he was saying we need to start killing Iranians and Russians in Syria?
Yeah.
Yeah, look, and Trump did it.
Right.
It's interesting to me that these hawks who there really is no partisanship. Once you get, there is, and there are differences in the administrations, I guess is what I'm saying. But the neoconservative agenda pervades the policy. It is. It may be executed differently, but the neocons are in power. And so you look at Trump coming in 2017, and you've got him putting out this new national security strategy and bringing Montenegro into NATO and doing the Atlantic Resolve military exercises in Estonia on Russia's borders, sending U.S. troops and tanks there, and arming Ukraine in 2017 and 2018. He's, like I said, killing Russians, launching all kinds of imposing all kinds of sanctions against Russia, particularly after the Skripal poisonings, which have been largely debunked. I mean, that story has been, I'm not really an expert on it, but certainly Craig Murray and Daniel McAdams and Moon of Alabama blog did incredible work poking massive holes in that story. But it was that you point out that this precipitated the largest diplomatic purge in U.S. history. We kicked out dozens and dozens of diplomats,
50 Russian diplomats. Mm-hmm. And apparently Trump got played on that one too. They told him that they were going to kick out as many diplomats as other countries. So they took all the NATO countries combined. And so, maybe Estonia had spelled 2, Lithuania had spelled 3. Well, that counted 5 of in America of Russians they were going to expel. And so it ended up being 50. So that was pretty crazy. One thing I had picked up today at antiwar.com, Connor, was that Biden is preparing a new round of sanctions against Russia. This one in support of opposition figure Alexei Navalny, who has a pretty troubling background. In fact, Aaron Mate today published a email he got from Amnesty International UK, where they are kind of backing off of their status of trying to protect Navalny because of the discriminatory and violent statements that he has made in the past and not retracted. So even like for a mainstream NGO like Amnesty International, they got some problems with Navalny, and yet the Biden administration is prepared to react just like Trump did to Sergei Skripal to Navalny here.
Yeah, I mean, the quotes from him are like, Muslims are like cockroaches. You just don't kill them with shoes, you kill them with machine guns, right? I mean, I'm paraphrasing that, but I'm pretty sure that is the video that was circulated quite a bit when they were putting out all those, videos that were supposed to tug at everybody's heartstrings of him making a little heart with his hands for his wife. And also, wasn't this, a very shady character. But this whole, and I still haven't seen definitive proof that the Russians, tried to poison this guy. What was it? German doctors said that he had some sort of nerve agent that was traced inside
Yeah,
of him
they
or
said
something.
it's Novichok. And then Navalny released a phone call that he had with what he claims to be a Russian member. Bellingcat did the whole report about this guy who they claim is a member of some chemical unit in Russia. I'm very skeptical of it. Navalny claims that, he got this guy on the phone and this guy admitted that, it was the Russians who did this. I guess it seems so sketchy to me, all the details. I guess, at the same time, though, I don't want to completely dismiss it's possible that Putin did this. I think he's a pretty thuggish ruler. I'm glad I'm not. If me and you were Russian citizens, I think we would still be libertarians and be saying, a lot against the Russian intervention overseas and the oppression that the Russian government has against the Russian people, and we would probably be subject to potentially some heavy-handedness from the Russian state in that position. That being said, I'm not a Russian citizen, and I don't think my government should necessarily put widespread penalties on the Russian state for something that they, with shaky evidence, claim that the government did. And so that's a real problem that I have with that. Do you want to talk about China as well? Because when we talk about great power, it's not just Russia, even though Russia has the largest nuclear arsenal and stuff like that. And I saw that very similar to the Biden administration continuing Trump's Russia policy and great power competition. Janet Yellen is putting out there that we're not going to remove the tariffs from China, continuing Trump's trade war. So, Connor, how's great power competition looking there?
Not good. The thing is there's a great report. So recently, a couple of things I've noticed that I found real interesting. So there's a report out from Reuters. I forget what the date is, but it was from, I think, a couple of weeks ago. But there's some interesting data here. So Reuters says the U.S.-China trade war has cost up to 245,000 U.S. jobs. But what it says here is U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war with China has caused a peak loss of 245,000 U.S. jobs, but a gradual scaling back of tariffs on both sides would boost growth and lead to an additional 145,000 jobs by 2025, a study commissioned by the U.S.-China Business Council shows. The group, which represents major American companies doing business in China, said the study by Oxford Economics also includes an escalation scenario, which estimates a significant decoupling of the world's two largest economies could shrink U.S. GDP by $1.6 trillion over the next 5 years. This could result in 732,000 fewer U.S. jobs in 2022 and 320,000 fewer jobs by 2025, it said. So, and we're seeing calls for decoupling from China from people like Tom Cotton, who, Tom Cotton is calling people in the Biden administration panda huggers, when everybody in the Biden administration, from what I can see, which is what I show in the last half of the piece, is most of the notable people are ardent China hawks, from Avril Haines, the director of national intelligence, to the UN. Has the Linda Thomas Greenfield
just got confirmed today.
Yet?
Yep, 80 to 20 votes. She was confirmed.
She's a hawk. She says she'll aggressively go after China at the UN. Blinken says, Trump was right to take his aggressive stance against China. He's basically underwritten all of Pompeo's positions vis-a-vis the South China Sea, and basically rejecting all of China's claims there, and therefore supporting the phone ops and the additional naval provocations there. You've got, Biden has put dual nuclear aircraft carriers in the South China Sea doing drills. I think that happened once in 2014, once in 2001. Trump did it last July, I want to say, and now Biden has done it. Biden, in his first weeks in office, was sailing warships through the Taiwan Strait. You've got warplanes in the South China Sea as well, flying through Taiwan's air defense identification zone. Right, and Tom Cotton is saying we need to draw red lines with China, that if they try to retake Taiwan, we will go to war with China, which would mean nuclear war, by the way. I know that Trump and Obama have invested each more than $1 trillion into revamping the nuclear arsenal and building these tactical nukes that are supposed to be low yield or whatever, which is a terrifying prospect. But that's where this is going. And, as Gareth Porter says, those Fortress Taiwan arms sales that we discussed before represent the greatest escalation in U.S.-China relations, certainly in this century. Selling them, the upgraded F-16s and the Boeing from Lockheed, and the Boeing SLAM missiles, air-to-surface missiles that can hit inland targets in China and the Nanjing region. You've got, and Taiwan is acknowledging the presence of U.S. warplanes in their air defense identification zone, more so than they usually do. This is under the Biden administration. Last year, I don't know if you remember, that they had the Marine Raiders. They were acknowledging that we were sending Marine Special Forces to Taiwan to train their military, which is something that they ordinarily do not talk about. So just mentioning that is, again, a very big escalation. And, Cotton is saying we need to move away from this sort of strategic ambiguity policy where we arm Taiwan, but it's really we don't commit to defending them in the case of a potential move against Taiwan from China. But he's saying, no, we absolutely need to draw a line in the sand, say we will go to war. And not just there. I mean, he's saying, if North Korea attacks the U.S. or its allies, we go to war with Beijing. Not that I think the North Koreans would do that, but we're seeing more and more escalations from other countries, like Japan, for instance, who Shinzo Abe says that part of their necessary self-defense is the ability to develop missiles that can hit inland targets in China and North Korea for preemptive strikes, for instance. And you've got an Australian senator, this Jim Loban, who said that he supports this, but he says, I could see the U.S. going to war in the South China Sea with China in the next 3 to 5 years, or 5 to 10 years. And you've got Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, saying we need to build up relations with India and Australia and New Zealand and like-minded countries to basically escalate this war footing. It's saying, there you go. Dave Decamp at antiwar.com. NATO chief says the rise of China is a defining issue for the alliance. And Biden was saying much the same stuff here at the Munich Security Conference. They, as Scott Ritter and Finian Cunningham have been saying, this is being used to prop up the U.S. empire and its military-industrial complex. These are cockamamie missions. The Europeans, as Doug Bandow would say, they thought there was a threat from Russia to retake Europe, they would spend more than just pennies on the dollar on their defense. This is, I mean, I like I said, it's just this great power competition. It's this new Cold War paradigm that has to be called out because it's showing no signs of stopping. And yeah, we are escalating on all fronts. And if you look at this Tom Cotton thing, if you look at people like Tim Pool, even people in the independent media who are hyping up sort of the propaganda about the Uyghurs, and I'm not suggesting that there's not something going on there, but as Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal just put out a report, that needs to be given a lot more scrutiny.
Right.
And
yeah.
It's
And
when you
actually,
start
that's,
saying that China's committing a Holocaust, it's real good war propaganda, especially for the American people who don't pay attention to this stuff.
Yeah, and that's actually the topic of Thursday's show. I want to get into, especially independent media voices echoing that. But Connor, I think that's a great place to wrap. Thank you so much for all the knowledge you dropped on the show today. Tell people where they can find your work. And one last time, check out the Libertarian Institute right now. Help out our 2021 fundraiser. Get yourself some great kit bats and help our great institute. And donations are tax deductible. Connor, where can they find your work?
The Libertarian Institute. Just check it out. I got all my stuff right now
on Twitter
up there, and at Freeman's Mind 96.
All right. Thanks so much, Connor.
Hey, thank you.